In the last two lectures, we've been looking at ethnic polarization and ethnic wars. In the following few lectures, we're going to start looking at models to manage ethnic differences. In this lecture, we're going to look at multiculturalism as a philosophy, as a policy, and really try to understand how does multiculturalism is utilized to manage ethnic differences. Visible ethnic diversity in Canada is relatively new. The majority of individuals prior to World War II were of British and French descendants. The first major wave of modern immigration can be seen from 1946 to the late 1960s. This was due to a system that encouraged family sponsorship, and as a consequence, chain migration of Western European groups were common. Notably, the Italians, the Portuguese, and the Greeks were the largest cohorts, and they ultimately changed the labor market demographics. Typically, the majority of immigrants who arrived during this period had close-knit family and friend connections. In addition, many came with little formal education and economic capital upon arrival. At the time, there were very few public programs to assist immigrants to integrate into the social milieu of the Canadian society. This resulted in many first-wave immigrants relying on their close connections to assist in integration, and it reduced their incentives to learn native English. And of course, what we did find is that their main modes of communication was their native language. In fact, due to the relatively low education levels, and for many the inability to speak English fluently, many first-wave immigrants, mostly men, filled positions as manual laborers, craftsmen, mechanics, and miners. Commentators have suggested the manual labor skills these groups possess is one of the predominant reasons why the Canadian government welcomed them. That is, the end of World War II brought an enthusiastic interest in revitalizing and modernizing and rebuilding the Canadian sort of economy. This involved the construction of roads, railways, and infrastructure. Taking advantage of the depressed economies and high unemployment rates in Western Europe, Canada encouraged immigrants from this region, with many Western European governments, especially the Italian and Greek governments, even assisting in actively promoting temporary and permanent immigration to Canada, since it provided relief to their ravaged domestic economies. In 1966, a new immigration policy based on a point system involving factors including age and occupational qualification replaced the older system which stressed sponsorship. This sparked the second major wave of immigration to Canada from the late 1960s to the late 1990s. Not coincidentally, only a year prior, we saw changes in the immigration policy from the Canadian government. Particularly, the Canadian government commissioned a preliminary report of the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, which is commonly referred to as the first use of multiculturalism as a social policy for managing ethnic differences. The change in immigration policy and the onset of a formalized multiculturalism policy signaled Canada's willingness to accept further immigrants from non-European ethnic backgrounds. The ripple effect was immediate in the ethnic minority demographics. In a matter of 30 years, non-European immigration from the Caribbean and Latin America, especially from the late 1960s to 1980s, and South and East Asia, mainly in the 1990s, multiplied almost tenfold, whereby about 40% of Toronto's 2001 total population were ethnic minorities. The non-European ethnic groups that dominated second-wave immigration to Toronto largely differed from the first wave, since they were more formally educated and experienced in skilled occupations. This was the result of a more stringent process in accepting immigrants based on a point system, which rewarded skills and education to the extent that 80% of newcomers to Toronto are secondary school graduates and 40% have completed university. However, upon arrival, many found that they were not readily employable in the profession of their home country. Professional degrees such as medicine and engineering were not recognized by the professional associations. Hence, Toronto is home to some of the most highly educated low-wage employees. there's often a strong undertone among second-wave non-European group members that they feel cheated upon settlement into Toronto. Like the first wave, many felt that they were brought here to undertake jobs that Torontonians no longer wanted. Mind you, this observation should be tempered by the fact children of immigrants with higher education are more likely to succeed in the education and occupational market than previous generations. Embroiled in this reality are theories such as multiculturalism, which have sought to address questions of equity within a legal and policy framework. We can potentially argue that in spite of multiculturalism's ability to manage ethnic difference through empowering ethnic minority groups in a legal and policy fashion, it does not necessarily tackle the root causes of ethnic minority groups' inequalities. Rather, it can be a preventative mechanism to manage ethnic difference. Multiculturalism can be seen as an inclusionary strategy designed to foster an equitable association among ethnic minority groups relative to the dominant groups of a community. At its most basic level, multiculturalism is a systemic and comprehensive approach to promote and manage ethnic difference via public policy with educational, economic, and social components. It has a relatively short history, globally speaking, with little empirical community evidence available on its operation and outcomes. The Canadian experiences with multiculturalism is thus paramount to understand its operations. The path multiculturalism has taken thus requires us to distinguish a description of a community as multicultural, so the demographically descriptive usage, from a political philosophy to a multicultural sort of policy as an inclusionary strategy developed to manage ethnic difference, or what we can see here as a programmatic sort of social policy usage. The Canadian government report, the preliminary report of the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism in 1965, as mentioned beforehand, marked the first usage of multiculturalism as an inclusionary strategy for managing ethnic difference. The report ultimately led to the establishment of what is known as the Canadian Multiculturalism Documents that formulates Canada's multiculturalism strategy. There's a 1971 policy announcement, the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is constitutionally protected, and the 1988 Multiculturalism Act. The specific mandates of multiculturalism in Canada were summarized in Section 5 of the 1988 Multiculturalism Act. It writes to encourage and assist individuals and organizations to project the multicultural reality of Canada, to encourage cooperation and exchange among the diverse ethnic groups of Canada, to facilitate the acquisition, retention, and use of all languages that contribute to the multicultural heritage of Canada, and finally to assist ethnic minority groups in conducting activities with a view of overcoming any discriminatory barrier. In short, Canada's multiculturalism documents project a statement of intent for an inclusionary strategy. It seeks to manage ethnic difference by fostering an environment in which ethnic minority groups can peacefully interact within a mixed community. Whether we believe multiculturalism can provide ethnic minority groups the space to achieve this ideal is another question. There are three interrelated and overlapping phases where public policies in Canada sought to implement multiculturalism, with each phase marked by considerable dialogue and discourse. I will briefly outline these phases. In the first phase, which we call the cultural reinforcement one, and this was marked particularly by the 1971 policy announcement. In the early 1970s, multiculturalism strategy was inspired by an emphasis on cultural support to promote inclusion. Public policies in education, employment, and community development encourage ethnic minority groups to increasingly bring their cultures into public activities. As a result, ethnic minority groups that had maintained their traditions and heritage in spite of the pressure to assimilate experience ethnocultural support rather than public policy pressures to assimilate. In phase two, where group relations was emphasized and it was also marked by the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, In the late 1970s and early 1980s, there became an awareness that intergroup relations had to be strengthened, given an increasing growth in the number of ethnic groups living in close proximity of each other. There was now, however, a growing concern that discriminatory attitudes based on historically based negative attitudes were restricting inclusion. There was a feeling that the dominant group in the various communities of Canada were trying to exclude others, maintain control, or limit ethnic group participation. In particular, there was evidence that public policies and community institutions from media to business were not adjusting to the recognition of full participation for all. As a consequence, public policies during this period increasingly emphasized intergroup relations, opening public institutions and sensitizing agencies to diversity. In the third phase, the anti-racism phase, coincided with the 1988 Multiculturalism Act. In this phase, from the late 1980s to mid-late 1990s, public policy sought to combat racism. This is particularly featured in the policies of large urban centers such as Vancouver, Montreal, or Toronto. The central issue here was that racism based upon physical characteristics had not been sufficiently addressed in a strategy of multiculturalism. Programs of affirmative action and positive hirings were encouraged by public policies during this period. The evidence offered from these three phases suggests that Canadian public policies were relatively effective in utilizing multiculturalism as a guiding inclusionary strategy and created the necessary space to reduce many of the problems that arise from ethnic differences. However, these phases also suggested that multiculturalism, for the most part, did not explicitly tackle the root causes of problems of ethnic differences in a very direct manner. That is, it did not fully tackle the social and economic inequalities and unequal access to a community's resources. Thus, in many respects, multiculturalism as conceived presently can be seen as a preventative mechanism for managing difference rather than a curative one. The close proximity of members of the same ethnic minority group in Toronto suggests there is a greater propensity to forge personal relations and interact in the everyday with one's own ethnic minority group. The question we need to ask ourselves, however, is this actually occurring? One of the advantages of Canadian multiculturalism policy is that it strives to define and celebrate Canadian identity by promoting the nation's ethnic diversity. With nearly 40% of Toronto's population comprising of visible ethnic minorities, Torontonians do not necessarily need policies to point out the obvious demographic ethnic diversity. However, in the name of promoting intra- and inter-ethnic interactions and enhancing the image of a multicultural Toronto, the city has supported numerous ethnocultural festivals, such as International Festival Caribana, showcasing dance, music, and cuisine of over 30 ethnic groups living in the city. It has supported the Chinese International Dragon Boat Race, the Festival of Southeast Asia, Muslim Fests, Taiwan Fest, Taste of Little Italy, and its Greek version, the Taste of the Danforth. One of the most famous ethnic-oriented festivals in the city is Caribana. Since 1967, Caribana has been held in the summer, showcasing Caribbean culture and traditions. Festival events include a full day of Caribbean food and performances in song, dance, drama, and storytelling, and a music series featuring calypso and reggae performers. The festival culminates in a 3.6-kilometer carnival-style street parade featuring colorfully dressed dancers, steel band, calypso music, and floats. With over 1.2 to 1.3 million Torontonians and visitors, spanning different ethnic backgrounds, the celebration of Caribbean culture is not only popular, but profitable. It brings in almost over $300 million to the local economy. Although Torontonians have indulged in the foreign exoticism of a non-threatening version of Caribbean culture, Many local Caribbeans have often wondered whether Caribana derails the progressive strides made by members of the Caribbean community in Toronto. For example, in the major Toronto-based Caribbean newspapers, Contrast and Share, articles and editorials often worry Caribana portrays peoples of the Caribbean as mainly as happy-go-lucky and fun-loving, rather than present their economic and social achievements. It is apparent that many festivals such as Caribana satisfy Canadian multiculturalism's goal of celebrating ethnocultural diversity. And it's evident that Toronto has been very supportive in promoting these initiatives. The problematic aspect of this celebration of ethnocultural diversity is that for most instances, it fails to include an acknowledgement and recognition of socioeconomic group and labor market inequalities. In other words, ethnocultural festivals often revolve around promoting music, dance, and food, suggesting that ethnic minorities are still being held in check by the earlier, less threatening cultural reinforcement stage of multiculturalism. Of course, we must point out that ethnocultural festivals encourage individuals and ethnic groups to learn about each other. Such festivals often represent an important narrative touchstone, so to speak, in the way many individuals define themselves. Whether a member of a particular ethnic group entirely embraces or rejects the often picturesque and celebratory portrayal of their ethnic community during these festivals, it's not really the only venue for ethnic groups to learn about and interact with each other. Strong ethnic networks of contacts and kinship are equally important influences on ethnic group representation and interaction. For example, amongst first-wave immigrants, due to an immigration policy that favored sponsorship as discussed earlier, members of ethnic groups who migrated during this period are still characterized by a high degree of group cohesiveness, cultural identification, language retention, and residential segregation. Using the Italian experience as an example, intimate and relatively constant inter-ethnic group interactions are less prevalent among the first generation than their offspring. That is, the second generation and beyond who have been socialized in Toronto their entire lives are more open to the possibility of inter-ethnic group interactions than the previous generation. However, accompanying the experiences of the second generation is a decline in ethnic identification. This can lead to the conclusion that second generation and beyond Italians have taken on their ethnic identity by association. Given the strong decline in the cohort's command of Italian, they make connections, for example, of being Italian Canadian by the consumption of Italian food or driving Italian cars. They are, in effect, subscribing to being an ethnic Italian in ways very much different than their parents' generation. The question we need to ask ourselves is, how do interactions and representation affect occupational chances? Do they affect job search patterns, hiring patterns, workplace advancement patterns? While the decline in ethnic identification is not necessarily a major issue with the relatively recent second wave of immigrants, one of the central issues affecting group interactions among this cohort is discrimination, whether it's real or perceived. According to recent ethnic diversity surveys, almost 35% of visible minorities in Toronto's sample reported being discriminated or treated unfairly, defined by the respondent. Disaggregated by ethnocultural groupings, the numbers rise beyond 50% for Blacks, predominantly from the Caribbean and Africa, and ranges between 33 to 35% amongst Asians, Chinese, and South Asians. In response, communities such as the Caribbean group have developed adaptive responses which have further molded the mandate of distinctive ethnic-based institutions. The Caribbean communities have worked with existing island associations, so the Jamaica Canadian Association, the Trinidad and Tobago Association, etc., and developed relationships with organizations such as the Black Business and Professional Association or the Black Chamber of Commerce to provide business advice, personal and family counseling, and legal counsel to service its members. Initiatives such as Black Pages, which contains a directory of Caribbean and African businesses, have been created to combat the potential threat of discrimination and economic disadvantages to the Caribbean population. Whether these initiatives are successful, mind you, in converting ethnic minority members' educational attainment into occupational outcomes will be examined in our later lectures. The evidence presented in this lecture suggests the institutionalization of ethnic relations may be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, celebratory festivals and events showcasing ethnic traditions and culture serve as a mechanism to promote minority groups to the mainstream. Yet, harsh criticism is levied when a packaged and commodified version involving song, dance, and foods is presented of a particular ethnic minority group. The central concern is that the socioeconomic and labor market struggles of many ethnic minority groups are being masked when a celebratory version of their culture and traditions is being presented. Suffice it to say, the well-being of recent immigrants remain a contested issue which becomes more evident when the behavior of the ethnic enclave and economy is examined. This concludes our lecture on multiculturalism. In our next few lectures, we'll be looking at how other societies globally manage ethnic differences. In our next lecture, we'll look at the European models.